speak with Andrew about a fourth-person perspective, and actually I think on the last conference call you spoke about equating turquoise as being the fifth-person perspective.
Yeah.
And I wondered, like, I've been wondering this for a while, like, how do you denote that in the integral mathematics? And maybe if you could, in third-person language, I mean, I guess you have to be at that altitude to really cognize fourth person, fifth person, sixth person, and, like, deeper. So I wondered if you might just speak about that, and
Sure.
I want to get a transmission here.
And keep in mind right at the beginning that we are, entering an area that can be very kind of complex, and there are just a lot of different ways that you can proceed here, and they're equivalent ways. So you have to just kind of say what each term means and kind of define it as you go along. And we certainly find that when it comes to even about third person, 3-P, what the third person, and I'm going to say the hyphens, and for reasons you'll see now it's important, what a third hyphen person approach means. In psychological literature, there's a little bit of disagreement on that, let alone what a fifth hyphen person perspective means. And let me also point out that a third hyphen person perspective is different than being a third person. So, so we can have, a third person can come in the room. So you and I are talking, and if I'm talking to you, I'm first person, and the person being spoken to is second person. So in this case, John is second person. And we're talking about Billy Bob, and the person or thing being spoken about is defined as the third person. So you and I are talking, the two of us are talking in a room, in comes Billy Bob, he's the third person. Now somebody else can come in, they're the fourth person, somebody else can come in, they're the fifth person, somebody else can come in, they're the sixth, somebody else the seventh, somebody else the 10th. If you have 20 people in a room, you have 20 persons, that's the 20th person. But you don't have a 20th person perspective. So even if we bring in a third person into the room, Billy Bob comes in, Billy Bob might only be developed to red. He might not be capable of anything other than a first hyphen person perspective. He might just be a first person perspective. So the fact that you bring a third person in doesn't mean that they have a particular type of perspective. That third person might just have a first hyphen P, a first person perspective. And I might be talking to you, and you might be a turquoise, you might have a fifth person perspective. You're the second person by definition, the person being spoken to. But you don't therefore only have a second-person perspective. So let's keep that in mind, first of all. There's a difference between a 3P and a 3-P. Mm-hmm. And, and a 4P and a 4-P. And between a 2P and a 2-P and so on. So now, generally, then, what the hyphens is what we're talking about. What does a 3-P mean, a 4-P mean, and a 5-P? What do those... And one of the easiest ways to get a hold of this is just to kind of follow it up the scale of development, because many developmentalists, I would say most, would certainly agree with it, but many of them actually present and define each higher major developmental level as being an addition of a perspective. And I think this is true, and I think it's extremely important. And so we'll walk up the scale to turquoise and kind of show what that means as we go. So we start out at the lower levels of development, and including infrared and magenta up to about red. And this really means the preoperational sensory motor and preoperational cognition, and particularly means cognition that really predominates during the first 4 or 5 years of life. And it means specifically a capacity, it's narcissistic or egocentric. It cannot take the role of other. It cannot take the role of a second person. It can be aware of what a second person is saying or doing, but can't actually put itself in their shoes and see through their eyes and try to tell you what it thinks they are seeing accurately. So up to red is a first P perspective, first person perspective. And then the move from egocentric to ethnocentric, or the move from pre-conventional to conventional, or even the capacity to take a conformist stance, which is amber or blue meme or mythic membership or conventional state stages of moral development and so on, which we generally call amber altitude, that's marked by capacity to take a second -p perspective, a second person perspective. So I can be aware of not just me, but what you're thinking, and therefore what first person plural, what we're thinking. So an us can develop. And so my identity can move from a me to an us. It can move from egocentric to ethnocentric. But I can't take a third -p perspective, a third person perspective. And that generally comes into existence with orange.
Mm-hmm.
So when orange is defined as capacity to take a 3-p perspective, but it immediately, third person perspective is often said it's an objective perspective, it's more scientific, it has a capacity for universalized truth, and so on. And where all of those come from is you and I are trying to determine if it's actually raining outside or if it only appears to be raining outside or looking through a window. We say, well, let's call Billy Bob in and see what he thinks. You and I disagree. I say it's raining, you say it's not raining. So we call Billy Bob in and say, what do you think? And Billy Bob says, well, I think it's raining. And still, we say, well, I don't know, let's call in the fourth person and the fifth person. And say, the more people you call in and say, do you think it's raining outside? And if the vast majority of them, 90, 95%, say it's raining outside, then that's considered more likely to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And the more people that you bring in, the more people it's likely to be true. Also, the more likely you are to get a lowest common denominator. And so that's why science indeed deals with things that are called, quote, objective truth. Because science attempts to check something under every possible condition with every possible observer.
Right.
If no exceptions are found to it, then it's said to be true. And if certain irregularities are being noted, then they might say we're talking about a true law of physics, and so on. But so that's what 3-p means. And technically, one of the ways to think about it, particularly as we move into fourth and fifth person, is if you bring the third person into the room, and what a 3-p perspective means is not just that they're aware of what the first person, what their view is, or their perspective, but a 3-p, a third-person perspective is the third person can tell you what the first person's view of the second person's view of the third person's view is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's those three different perspectives that constitutes a third-p perspective, a third-person perspective. So the third person can tell you if it's Ken, John, and Billy Bob, and John has a third-person perspective, then John can tell you what Billy Bob's thoughts about Ken's thoughts about John are.
So it's like you're able to see into somebody's ability to take perspectives or see through their eyes.
You're allowed to see through their eyes in the sense of you can take what their perspective on another perspective is.
Wow.
So, and this starts, well, it's just like saying, though, if I look at you and say, do you think that Jane was telling the truth and she said she loved me? We do this all the time. But now, if we go back to second person, then the easiest way to remember that is the second person's view is you and I are talking, and a second person's view can tell what your view of my view is. So you have a perspective cross perspective.
Got it.
And there are two terms to that. And that's what a second person, that's the easiest way to remember what a second person means. And we just saw that a third person had three terms. It was being able to tell what a first person's view of the second person's view of the third person's view was, or what the second person's view of the third person's view of the first person's view was, and so on. So it was like a perspective of a perspective of a perspective. Mm-hmm. And we just represent that by saying P times P times P. Mm-hmm. That's a third person. And a second person is a P times P. Mm-hmm. I can tell you and I are talking. I can tell you not only what my view is, and not only what your view is, but what your view of my view is.
Got it.
So that is the trick. And then push back to red. Red can only tell you what its view is.
Right.
That's a 1P. It just has one term. Second person is a P times P. P meaning perspective or view or even person in that sense. A third -P is a P times P times P. And yes, a fourth person perspective is a P times P times P times P. Now, it's kind of important, so I'll take another 2-3 minutes to go through this. People get a little tripped up on it, but once you get it, it's incredibly important for seeing what development is about. But notice even if we go back to second person, that what happens when you can give a perspective on a perspective is you start to escape your own.
Right.
You start to transcend your own. And red, of course, and everything lower, including all the way down the scale of evolution, every individual holon is essentially a 1-P. It's stuck in its own view. Now, we believe they have mutual resonance. That's another story. We'll talk about that later. We believe that every holon has a lower left quadrant and can mutually resonate with similar holons. But as for taking a reflective view, in all of evolution, that doesn't start until red altitude in humans. And all of a sudden, you have enough cognition, in this case, concrete operational, that you can, just as this phrase sounds like, it's a concrete operation. You can operate, it's not just thought looking or representing the world. It's thought can begin to operate on the world. You can begin to reflect on thinking itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that gets you up into amber altitude. So you can take a perspective on your perspective and also a perspective on the person's perspective who's talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that P times P is, one way to think about it is that times, or P cross P, that little cross, at X means transcend. So by the time we get to third person perspective, the idea is that the person can come in and give a perspective on a perspective on a perspective. Now that happens to a type of thinking that is then thought operating on thought. And that's called hypothetico-deductive reasoning. But it's also very simple. It's conditional reasoning. So to be able to say, what if we do this? Or it's as if I were doing this. That doesn't come into existence until late amber, early orange. It's formal operational cognition. And so that's very important. That's why science, as we normally think of it, a modern experimental science, doesn't come into being until orange.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why when we say, I want a third-person view of this, we mean that's universal, that's science, that's objective, that's what we mean. It means we can get a view on a view on a view and therefore really check it from as much as we possibly can. So we have three terms now, P times P times P, and we're at orange, and that's a third-person, a 3-P, third-person perspective. Third-person view, beginning universalized view, quote, scientific view, and so on. So what happens if we look at what formal operational cognition, or orange altitude cognition, what it does, it starts to create these universal systems. And these universal systems, particularly, this is what marked the Enlightenment. Enlightenment was not marked by atomistic thinking. That's just hogwash. It was primarily marked by the capacity to think of nature as a system. And of course there are atomists in the Enlightenment. The atomists go all the way back to Democritus and before then. And right. You always have atomists and holists at whatever level you're at in their own version. But what marked the Enlightenment was the system de la nature, the capacity to start thinking in these universal systems. And that's why you started to get physics and biology and chemistry and all of these things emerging. And so there was thought to be a sort of a single universal truth for all people. But notice what we said when we said that, you know, if we start bringing all our friends in to find out if it's raining or not, that we were likely to get the truth, but it was likely to be the lowest common denominator.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody has to agree on it. So if we were trying to get people to agree that I think the rain is beautiful, and then you say, I think beautiful, that makes no sense to me. I don't think the rain is beautiful. It's just rain. And I go, wait a minute, let's call him Billy Bob. Billy Bob, don't you think that rain is beautiful? And Billy Bob is like, give me a beer. Okay. Let's get Nancy in here. Nancy comes in. I think it's beautiful. Okay, well, now two people think it's beautiful. One person doesn't. One person wants a beer. Let's bring somebody else in. The more people you bring in, though, the less likely you are going to get a consensus on this.
Mm.
So that's why science, at least it's typically done, it does not have to do this, is reductionistic. It is truth, and it's universal truth, but it leaves all the human factors out of it, and it just devastates them. And that's where you started to get the reaction to the Enlightenment, the romantic reaction in particular, but also the idealistic reaction. You started looking the other direction and say, wait a minute, let's go in the other direction. Let's go towards higher consciousness, not lowest common denominator. But what happens with green altitude, and this is the whole cultural creatives, and it's the whole postmodern rise, is that it can take a 4-P, a fourth-person perspective. And what that means, in addition to the fact that it is a P times P times P times P, it means you can take a perspective on these universal systems.
Mm.
And once you do that, you start to put them all next to each other and say, wait a minute, not only are there all sorts of different kinds of universal systems, there are things like cultural truths and cultural social creation of knowledge that's not getting told in this story of, quote, universal science. And so what green does, or what a fourth-person perspective does, and incidentally, yes, developmentalists say that green has a fourth-person perspective. That orange can take a third-person perspective, green can take a fourth-person perspective. And, of course, we're heading towards turquoise, which is fifth-person. So green can take a fourth person, and that gets us from modernism to postmodernism. It gets us from universal truth, but a universal truth that's one-size-fits-all. You'd be very reductionistic and very, in that sense, very oppressive to other kinds of truths. So what the fourth-person perspective does is it alerts us to all these multicultural truths that, in a sense, every different culture has its own truths. In some sense, you can think of every individual as being their own truth. So all of a sudden now, instead of having like one lowest common denominator truth, every culture is its own truth. And no culture can comment on another culture. You can't say one culture is better than another. You can't even say one individual is better than another. And you get this whole explosion of pluralism.
Right.
And there is a great deal of truth to pluralism. The problem is, of course, it is a chaotic catastrophe.
Yeah.
And that once you free people from this oppressive, orange, universal, monolithic truth for everybody, and you start introducing gender truths and racial truths and economic truths and cultural truths and et cetera, fine, you've got all these truths in the world and absolutely no way to judge them or grade them, and all of a sudden you've just got a disaster, and unless you introduce some other term, then pluralism, left to its own devices, like every level left merely to its own devices, tends to degenerate and get into, we call it the mean green meme. Of course, there's a mean orange meme. Scientific materialism is the mean orange meme. And it's just as rude in its own way as the mean green meme is, but the mean green meme is really mean. And it's what's turned into sort of the whole extreme political correct movement and all of that. So what happens then is that there's very important things that are introduced by a fourth-person perspective. And if the orange third-person perspective, which gives us a P times P times P, if that P times P times P is a universal system, then pluralism is a P, a perspective on that universal system. But it's a P times P times P times P in any event. It's a fourth-person perspective. And it gives us this wonderful richness of pluralism. But again, left to its own devices, it degenerates into really nihilism, narcissism, and a desperately fragmented world, which is sort of what we're starting to see now. So as you develop then to the next major level, which will yellow or teal, we'll just go straight to turquoise, although this is true of yellow to a large degree, but I'll just refer to second tier as turquoise for ease of simplicity. It is a perspective on, it's the fifth-person perspective, it is indeed a P times P times P times P times P. And as we see, that sounds terribly complicated, but it's no more complicated, as I say, than pluralism, which is having a perspective on all various types of universal systems. Educated adults do these things all the time. They are not as complex as they sound when you write them down. And a fifth-person perspective is indeed a perspective on pluralism. And therefore, as it turns out, the fifth-person perspective can see what the fourth-person perspective could not see about itself. Namely, that there are all sorts of other currents, universal currents, that tie together these different systems. That there are things that the world's cultures have in common. And there are ways that you can look at them. Don't reduce them, of course. They have their irreducible differences, but they also have commonalities. And that's why all of a sudden the chaos of all of first tier jumps into a clarity of second tier integral patterns. And that's why there's such a huge leap between first and second tier. That's why Claire Grace called it a, quote, unimaginable gulf of meaning is passed when you go from first tier to second tier, because all of a sudden you can see how all of these things fit together. And that's what turquoise does with its fifth-person perspective. And so if you look at Jane Lovinger and Suzanne Cook-Greuter's developmental sequences, for example, and you look at any of the ones that Suzanne has presented in the various work she's done, you usually see a diagram. And on the right side of that diagram, yeah, it has 1P, 2P, 3P, 4P, 5P. And, of course, it means hyphen. Technically, it'd be 1 hyphen P, 2 hyphen P, and so on. That's what they're talking about. And I think it's absolutely on the money and is a very, very important truth. And I believe that, realistically speaking, the perspectives go to a 7 hyphen P, which is indigo, and third tier goes to 6th person, and then the upper limit of third tier, overmind, is 7th person, and then above that, it's just all we can really say is infinity. And so I believe that at least 7 hyphen P is realistic in terms of consciousness development as we understand it right now, and that as the real course of action and the real locus of interesting evolution is right now turquoise, and at people starting to take an integral perspective or 5th person perspective on these events. So that's a 15-minute answer going through the whole development sequence to see if that brings some clarity to it.
Oh, Ken, that was completely awesome.
It's kind of fun, isn't it? When you see the kind of beauty of it, it's all it is spirit unfolding more perspectives on itself and on its own manifestation. And that's why I said each of those little X's, in a sense, is a transcendence, a capacity to move beyond until it moves into infinity in terms of structures. And so there's a real elegance to that story. It's a good story. I like that story. And you like it too. I'm glad. I think it's great. It's great.
It is a little bit more.
Sure. Again, the easiest way to remember those is it's not so much that when you're having a 6th person perspective, you are, going, oh, it's his person's view of his person's view of her person's view of their person's view of that person's view. It's more that these kind of units, although microgenetically, we believe that happens. That there really does kind of shoot to a capacity to do that microgenetically, moment to moment, in other words. But really what happens is kind of earlier stages are just kind of chunked together. So orange, for example, you just pick up an orange conception. As soon as we say that, there's gravitation or light is over here or it's raining outside, and so we're presuming universally that that's true and that a 3rd person perspective would prove it. And when we think of pluralistic notions of multiculturalism and the social construction, or I would say, co-construction of knowledge, we're automatically thinking in, 4th person gestalts. Mm-hmm. And likewise, when we think of an integral thought, here's a really good example of what I'm talking about. If you look at the little 4-quadrant diagram that we often use, and that has, in the upper left, it's prehension and sensation, impulse, image, concept, rule, etc. In the upper right is atoms, molecules, cells, neural cord, etc. Standard little 4-quadrant. It's laid out there on the paper. It looks all simple. It's a little 2-dimensional thing. But keep in mind that if spiral dynamics is right, and Claire Graves is right, and that in order to understand holarchy, the first tier is a holarchy, that's not understood until yellow or turquoise. Mm-hmm. So in the little 4-quadrant diagram has, in its upper left, has vision logic. So that's turquoise. So if you understand what that means, then you're already using 2nd tier. You're already using turquoise. In other words, to actually look at that 4-quadrant map and understand it, you're already using a 5th person perspective. Just looking at it. If you actually understand the nested holarchies and so on. So that's why, even when we think about and talk about some of these integral ideas, we're really just already working with these integral gestalts that we start to understand when we have a capacity for turquoise cognition. So to simply be aware of integral ideas, how they all fit together, and to start to get an understanding of where you see these integral gestalts almost intuitively arising, and you have this almost instant, not vision logic, but vision, that does understand them and understands these 5th person integral notions and just sees them at a glance, then that's a 6th person perspective. And I do call that, at Indigo, that's what I call vision. And not just simple vision of a intuitive type or a states type that can occur at red or orange or any of those. But this actually cognitive capacity of vision, or then they'll call it the illumined mind. And he had, his higher 4 levels were the higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, overmind, supermind. And so this illumined mind, this capacity to simply and immediately see truth as a whole at a glance. That's indigo, and that's a 6th person. And of course it doesn't mean that the truth that you see is always true. Just like you can have turquoise ideas, doesn't mean they're always right. You have to check them. But it does mean that this is how you see them. It's almost a capacity to sort of instantaneously grasp 5th person gestalts and groups of them. And that's why the universe, the entire manifest world at that point, really hangs together in the palm of your hand as a readily understood entity. Now, of course, you still have to check it out. You still have to do science with it, etc. You can be wrong, but that's how it's grasped. And the 6th person ushers you into the whole, really, 3rd tier domain. And there are all sorts of variations on that. We call it paramind, metamind, and overmind. And it basically marks the truly transpersonal structures, not states, of development. And then 7th person, which is sort of the end limit for us, is overmind. And that is simply a grasp not just of all of the gross or 1st tier, and not only all of 2nd tier, but also all of 3rd tier. In the same way, it's a single glance, and for the manifest domains, it means you're seeing grosso and causal manifest domains, and at least as far as we're aware of, there are no higher realities. And so that's what we're postulating, is a grosso causal, and then there's a fully unmanifest. So it's being able to grasp those at single glances, and that's just generally how I tend to use 7th person perspective. And of course, all of this is very tentative and working our way into it, but we have developmental empirical studies all the way up to 5th person. It's very solid stuff. And the thing to really take away from this is each increase in perspective is just that, an increase in capacity to take more roles, to understand more sentient beings, to put yourself in the place of more sentient beings and hold them in your love and compassion. And it's also is a increase in freedom. As I said, it's an increase in transcendence. So there's an increase in degrees of freedom. And there are, in a sense, 7 degrees of freedom. And that also means 7 degrees of love. Because each one is an increasing, going from egocentric love to ethnocentric love, into will-centric love, into cosmocentric love, and into one taste.
Wow. Do you think, like you've mentioned, cosmic karma and creativity, how these higher stages are almost completely unmanifest? Like there's a little bit of, some sense of a vibration and cognition, but almost completely open, and like the universe itself, like the way it's unfolded, it didn't necessarily have to unfold this way. It could have if we take it back to the past, it could have unfolded in any variety of ways. And there's something with the choosing faculty itself, how we make, choices. Is there really a choice, or is it, it's
it's fascinating, isn't it? And what you're talking about, what we sort of call cosmic grooves and morphogenetic fields, in a broad sense, not just in the way Sheldrake uses them, but in the way they're generally used as morphogenetic just means development of form. And morphogenetic itself was introduced by Waddington, the great biologist. And so we talk about morphogenetic grooves in the cosmos, and what you're talking about is what I believe is, in a sense, the post-metaphysical way to think about these stages or levels that kind of gets us out of what just turned out to be inseparable problems with the metaphysical or the traditional way of looking at these in a Platonic sense as pre-existing structures. The great chain of being, which is sort of more or less given. There are just so many levels and so many structures, and during process of involution, spirit threw itself out and creatively created all of these structures or sheaths, as indeed sheaths in its own being, consciousness, and bliss, but reduced versions. Spirit was playing a game of hide and seek. And the levels, the great chain is always tied with a theory of both Maya, which means illusion, and Leela, sport and play. It was a game. Spirit woke up to itself, and as soon as every sentient being had woken up, it said, okay, game's over. Okay, I got it, you're it. Okay, let's do it again. So what else are you going to do? I mean, you're sitting there, you bathe in your glory and your bliss and your awareness for gazillions of years, and at some point you say, okay, I want to play. And the only way I can really have fun is if I pretend not to be me. So the way you play a game is you decide to fall asleep and not know when you wake up. And that'll be a game. And you'll have horrifying experiences, and the awakening will be made all the more fun, the more gruesome you can make the nightmares in between. And so, believe me, being exposed to boomeritis in the 1980s is as gruesome a nightmare as anybody could ever be to endure. But spirit throws itself out and first creates soul, which is a reduced version of itself, and then forgets its spirit when it does that. And the soul throws itself out. It's kind of a one long pitch that just continues to carry through. So soul is created, and then the awareness or spirit forgets its soul, and mind is created, which is a reduced version of soul. And then mind forgets itself, and body or life is created, and even life forgets itself, and matter is created. And then pow, the Big Bang. And all there is to the Big Bang is material particles or subparticles or preparticles or strings or whatever one is postulating nowadays. And some people would say, well, in that initial Big Bang, the anthropic folks would say that there's actually kind of a secret code left in that Big Bang such that a lot of what is to follow is the kind of the basic determinants are set. But none of the contents are at all. But however you interpret that or not, the idea is here you have matter, and now matter slowly starts unfolding and winding itself back towards spirit. Now, else does, from dirt to Shakespeare is quite a trip, and it just begs belief that, chance and mutations did all that stuff. But in any event, that's another story. The traditional story is that these levels were created in involution and fixed. And then evolution is just rewinding the videotape. And for some people, actually, the surface structure is also fixed. Just the whole thing is just kind of fixed. And then you rewind it and back from matter into life, into mind, into soul, and spirit. Now, most traditions just maintain that the realms, the levels are set. Matter, body, mind, soul, spirit. And that one is then finding one's way back to that the universe unfolds and one moves through those levels back to source and back to a remembrance and awakening as spirit. But all those are still pre-existing now. And there's no real room in virtually any of the accounts, one or two very rare exceptions, of all of the structures really just being open. So what we're postulating is that there are a few what we call involutionary givens, which means that there are a certain amount of things that you just have to presuppose to get a universe going at all. And following Occam's razor, indeed, we make those as few as possible. That's all we say. The post-metaphysical approach just says, get rid of everything you possibly can as being pre-postulated and created by spirit. Because it's just hard to prove, and it gets you in trouble. And you might not need it. Occam's razor's perfectly fine approach on this. So we whittle it down, and we certainly do not include all these pre-fixed structures that exist entirely independent of perception. That's just a no-go. So what we replace it with is that spirit, beginning in matter, and this drop of experience, this moment's experience, prehends the previous moment, and that means that all of Whitehead, the subject of this moment, becomes an object of the subject of the next moment.
Mm-hmm.
And that really means, Whitehead didn't use this phrase, but it really means that this moment transcends and includes the previous moment.
Yep.
And once you have that, you have holarchy, guaranteed, because you have transcend and include. So each moment has two components to it. It has an include component, which ensures continuity, this moment has to be in some way similar to the previous moment, or the universe would just fall apart. I mean, there has to be some continuity between the previous moment and this moment. And then it has a component of novelty or discontinuity, and that's the transcend part, the creative part.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great formulation. That part itself is largely based on Whitehead. I think he's right on the money on that. And I think he was right that as the creative moment, if this moment adds almost no creativity to the stream, then there's just the similarity to the previous moment. And so it starts to look like causality.
Right.
And that's why physical atoms and so on, they add very, very little novelty. It's not zero, but it's very little, and therefore you get a whole lot of causality, what looks like causality going on in the physical domain.
Gotcha.
But far from equilibrium, the novelty component increases. And so you start to get increasingly complex physical forms as life starts to emerge. And so what we're postulating is just that, is that at the edge of evolution is tetrahension, is moment to moment, drop of experience, and each drop has 4 quadrants, because we believe that's the basic structure. And so there's a tetrahension, or tetraprehension, moment to moment, transcend and include. And as that continues, that novelty component, when a new structure is laid down, there is a fair amount of choice going on there.
Right.
And so by the time we get to humans, and the example we give right now is, let's say, well, turquoise is kind of getting laid down. It's still very thin. But let's go ahead and use indigo, which is probably well less than 1/1000%. And so people that are starting to have their cognition stably transcend turquoise doesn't mean that they're jumping to indigo. They can't, because there's nothing to jump to. It's still unformed. But you look at the previous stages that have already occurred. You look at red right now, and that's like the Grand Canyon. That's, it's been laid down so many times. The groove is so deep that everybody, in a sense, has to go through red, because it's just become such a cosmic habit, and it's been transcended and included in so many higher structures that it's just down there. It's almost as if it were predetermined.
Right.
And it's certainly the case that for the average human, if you're a Plotinus, for example, and you're at, let's say he's, just for sake of argument, the center of gravity was turquoise, then he's going to look at all these earlier structures and think that they're always there.
Yep.
Because that's what it would look like to him, and for everything that he could possibly know. And so he would simply assume, like Plato and so many other traditions, that these are just fixed levels in a great chain.
Aurobindo did that too, didn't he?
He did to a large degree, and that is, as much as he was developmental, he was really right on the cusp. And there are cases where he seems to really see beyond it, but in so many cases he would say, yes, during involution, it's laid down, and there are actually beings, or also there are angelic beings and all sorts of mythic beings that actually exist and are basically populating these levels of existence, these planes of existence, and that we are indeed sort of moving back through them. And then the one area that he really starts realizing something higher structures, that it's just down there, is almost as if it were predetermined.
Right.
And it's certainly the case that for the average human, if you're a Plotinus, for example, and you're at, let's say he's, just for sake of argument, the center of gravity was turquoise, then he's going to look at all these earlier structures and think that they're always there.
Yep.
Because that's what it would look like to him, and for everything that he could possibly know. And so he would simply assume, like Plato and so many other traditions, that these are just fixed levels in a great chain.
Aurobindo did that too, didn't he?
He did to a large degree, and that is, as much as he was developmental, he was really right on the cusp. And there are cases where he seems to really see beyond it, but in so many cases he would say, yes, during involution, it's laid down, and there are actually beings, or also there are angelic beings and all sorts of mythic beings that actually exist and are basically populating these levels of existence, these planes of existence, and that we are indeed sort of moving back through them. And then the one area that he really starts realizing something is going on is the actual overmind and supermind. And he knows that evolution is a dynamically evolutionary unfolding, but he did tend to see evolution as a kind of a rewinding the videotape. But at Supermind, weird stuff is going on. It's like he knew that there was a whole creative thing going on there. And all I'm saying is that that's just the leading edge of creation for him, that same creative component was going on all the way back down into Rad, and all the way back down in Big Bang, actually. But once the choices are made, when Rad was first being laid down, about 20,000 years ago, that was a leading-edge choice. And to be able to go from mere magic, sort of magenta or purple indissociation of self and nature, to actually create an individualized, this is a huge leap. And it's created a really enormous number of kind of heroes making that leap. But now it's like every 2-year-old goes through it.
Right.
And so once the choices are increasingly made, Red was increasingly made, by the time we get to 10,000 BCE, by the time we get to 4,000 BCE, a whole new, so many people have moved into amber, or the blue meme, that it's the groove of amber is starting to become deeper and deeper. And all these grooves are, I say, give you an analogy, it's sort of like dragging a stick across the ground. It's only, at first it's just a little bitty line in the ground. But if somebody else comes along with a stick and drags it through that same similar line, same direction, then it gets a little bit deeper, and then a little bit deeper, and a little bit deeper. And everybody goes, a little bit different as they go through it, but it's still in that same general line. But pretty soon, it's like the formation of going from a small stream, to a small river to an Amazon. And Red is like, it's this huge Grand Canyon. It's cut so deep. Amber's cut, if Red is cut a mile down, I don't know what it is exactly. Amber is like 3/4 of a mile. Orange now is like about a half mile. Orange has been cut for about 300, 400 years. Green is only about 20 or 30 yards down deep. Green is only, as a large choice of a large number of people, has only been around for about 40 years. In 1959, about 2% of the population was green. Today, about 22% is. But now, the action is at turquoise, which is only about a foot down.
Right.
And indigo, which is just a little line across the ground.
It seems like the collective aspect of this is what's really important. Like that, like we're co-creating, these structures. That's why we need each other to sort of, it's almost like playing with atomic fuel. And like if you're off by yourself,
you got to be careful.
But you got to be really careful.
I think that's a good point, and we sort of make it, we say it's kind of like a new categorical imperative. It's like, act as if the set of choices that you make now is to constitute a stage of development for all human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And you get very straight if you do it. And that, of course, is giving ourselves a great pat on the back, assuming that we're a turquoise and an indigo. And that's okay. Somebody is. Somebody is that indigo, dragging these sticks across the ground, and already 2 to 3%, well, already about 2% of the population is a turquoise. So there are a fair number of people doing this. And whoever is doing that, and I think anybody on this call, frankly, would be part of that, or I don't think they'd be interested in this stuff. Just get straight. And it doesn't mean you have to be puritanical. It means almost the opposite. It means party well. And it doesn't mean don't party. It means do it well. And with a great deal of aesthetics and goodness and truth and beauty, and just have a great deal of fun. But it also means, in your cognition and your ideas and your thoughts, we are, dragging a stick across the ground. Now, 1,000 years from now, this, let's say, turquoise again, probably every high school kid will be going through it. And center of gravity will be somewhere around indigo to violet. And that'll be the stick across the ground. And then, frankly, 100,000 years from now, assuming that spirit doesn't just, wake up and dissolve the game again. But assuming, let's just assume for sake of argument it goes on, then what we call overmind, well, we'll have found 10 more levels than that. It just keeps going at the upper reach. And it's creative at that upper reach, so that can account for all of these levels of consciousness appearing as if they're structures that were preformed. But they're not. They're habits. They're cosmic habits that have been laid down. And, of course, at the leading edge, there's a great deal of choice and freedom. But once it's laid down, less so. And once it's laid down for, a century or so, almost no choice at all. I mean, you're going through red, you're going through amber, you're going through orange, deal with it. So what we hope, of course, is that you lay down a structure in as healthy a way as possible. And history is not a happy story on this one. Orange started out very healthy, extraordinarily healthy. And with the differentiation of the value spheres, differentiation of the quadrants, differentiation of the big three, on a cultural scale, differentiating art, morals, and science, so that each could be honored. And within a century, science had colonized the art and morals component. The right-hand quadrants had, in a sense, invaded and taken over the left-hand quadrants. Long story on that one. That's the mean orange meme. And green, likewise, emerged very healthy. In the 60s, it was the basis of the civil rights movement and early positive forms of feminism and some of the great initial forms of environmentalism and ecology and so on and on and on. And within about 30 years, in many ways, we had the mean green meme. We had some of the dysfunctional, unhealthy forms of green that really tend to dominate, certainly academia. So what we want is to really, it's not too late to turn green around a little bit. It's harder to turn orange around. The four-quadrant matrix of orange it's just pretty scientific materialism, and that's just a crying shame. Doesn't have to be in an individual sense, doesn't have to be in a particular group, university, and that. It's just generically, orange tends to come a little bit preloaded now in its reductionistic morphogenetic form. We can turn green around. I still hope against hope, that green can be laid down in a more healthy form for future generations. And we hope, of course, as turquoise and indigo get laid down, to do so in as healthy a form as possible.